are over. Underwritten by UK Insurance Limited.
Supercharged current affairs debate and electrifying opinion. Ian Collins on Talk Radio.
Good afternoon. 20 past 2. It's Ian Collins in for Matthew Wright. Kevin O'Sullivan is here. And, of course, Annabelle Giles is here. Counsellor, psychotherapist, presenter, an all-round good egg.
Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure.
Yeah.
We've got a lot going on here this afternoon. We'll come to some more stories in a second. There is another story we want to look at as well, because we were talking about, Kev, the issue of foreign aid.
Yeah, how do we feel about 7 million quid of British taxpayers' money being given to mega-rich China to encourage Chinese people to use less salt in their cooking? Are we thrilled that the UK hands more than £2 million to economically booming India to fund text messages urging Indian citizens to cut down on their drinking? Meanwhile, Chile got 300 grand to evaluate the efficacy of its sugar tax. A new report by the Institute of Economic Affairs reveals that the government shelled out 45 million quid in foreign aid to pay for other countries' Nanny State projects all over the world. The government insists that its foreign aid expenditure meets international rules and is subjected to extensive independent scrutiny. But if we do want to help abroad, shouldn't the UK be funding the fight against hunger and disease rather than these strange kind of domestic projects, it seems to me? Let's talk to one of the authors of this report from the Institute of Economic Affairs. That's Mark Tovey. Hello, Mark.
Hello, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Why are we giving, or why did we give China 7 million quid to encourage Chinese people to use less salt in their cooking?
Well, that's a very good question. And of course, as you said, traditionally, foreign aid health spending has been all about controlling infectious diseases, things like anti-malarial bed nets, clean water projects, vaccine drives. What we call a nanny state foreign aid is really a marked contrast with what we've come to expect from foreign aid. I think, really, in part, we have to blame Cameron's government for this, because it was him who introduced in 2015 what they called a cross-government strategy to foreign aid spending, which basically took hundreds of millions of pounds away from the dedicated aid department and put it into the hands of other departments like the Department of Health and the Department of Business. And the idea was that this would draw on the expertise of other civil servants. But really what we're seeing is that they're not prioritising poverty reduction, and instead they're spending on pet projects like the ones that you described in the introduction. For example, £350,000 analysing a sugar tax in Chile, and Chile is the richest country in South America. So, and this is just clearly a pet project of the Department of Health. As we know, the Department of Health introduced a sugar tax in the UK just last year. So this type of spending, they're just using the windfall, hundreds of millions of pounds from the foreign aid budget, and spending it on things which have absolutely nothing at all to do with poverty reduction.
Why are we giving money at all to countries like China, a massively rich country, and India that has its own space program?
Well, again, that's a good question, because clearly you're going to make the biggest impact spending in the poorest countries where the money will go further. For example, we did a cost-effectiveness analysis as part of our report, and we found that, for example, £5 million spent on an anti-smoking campaign, that could have bought 3 million anti-malarial nets for people in sub-Saharan Africa, and 400,000 people die every single year of malaria. It's an illness which affects people under 5 predominantly. So, yeah, as you say, really, this money would be better spent. It would go much further if it was spent on the traditional kinds of things like controlling infectious diseases in the really poorest countries of the world.
But to go back to that point about India, sorry to labour the point, but why, if India can afford its own space program, why do we decree that it needs money from us?
Well, it's a crazy thing, really, isn't it? I mean, it's the OECD who set the rules. They have a list of the aid-eligible countries, and it's based on our income level. And while we have committed as a nation to follow the OECD's rules on aid giving, and so therefore, countries like China, which we may think are not really worthy of our aid, actually do qualify under these rules. So a lot of people have argued we should break away from the OECD's rules and set our own common sense standards.
Can I put forward a theory, Mark? A lot of people sort of dismiss foreign aid, British foreign aid, as sort of bleeding heart, hand-wringing money to virtue signalling our wonderfulness as a nation. But is it not often actually the opposite of bleeding heart money? It's to grease the wheels of trade deals.
Well,
the kind of bribery, if you see what I mean.
Well, possibly, but I think that it's clear that the public don't want their foreign aid spent on sort of wheel greasing, as you've described it. They want it to be used to help people who are starving, people who are suffering from infectious diseases. But sadly, there's a movement towards accepting this nanny state foreign aid as being a legitimate type of help. For example, the World Health Organization, they've redefined malnutrition so that it no longer only refers to skeletal, starving people. Now, malnutrition, according to the World Health Organization, also includes obesity. They define it as referring to imbalances, deficiencies, or excesses in diet.
Is there anything we can... Sorry to interrupt. Is there anything we can do about this? Can anything be done?
Well, I mean, we need to acknowledge that this type of aid spending is not in line with what people expect, and for one, I would argue that we need to move away from Cameron's cross-government aid strategy and take the money away from the Department of Health and the Department of Business, because it's not only us at the Institute of Economic Affairs saying this, also the cross-party parliamentary committee, which analyses international development, have said that these DFID, Department for International Development, the other departments of government, when they spend aid, they don't prioritise poverty reduction. They spend on these kind of vanity schemes. They spend to further their pet projects and to sort of give a handout even to people who they've got good relations with. For example, we found a certain academic called Professor Graham McGregor at Queen Mary University. He was an instrumental architect of the salt reduction scheme in this country, which has been going for about 10 years now. So he's very closely connected with the Department of Health. And he's now in charge of that £7 million salt research unit to cut Chinese consumption of salt. So really, I would argue the solution is to move the money back towards poverty reduction, ending hunger, stamping out infectious diseases. These jobs still have not been done.
So keep it more focused in that respect. Mark, thank you. Mark Tovey from the Institute of Economic Affairs and author of that report. This came in from Tad, who says, essentially, I think echoing your point, Kev, the foreign aid budget is simply to grease the wheels of reciprocal commerce. Does that mean India and China give the UK money in return to aid their exports to us? Personally, I very much doubt it. The foreign aid budget is a murky liberal construct that needs to be overhauled.
It's a good question. Do we get any foreign aid from anyone?
I don't know. Don't look at me. I don't know.
You're not the Oracle of Delphi when it comes to foreign aid.
I know nothing about foreign aid.
Yeah. Okay, we'll take some news. We return with more stories in a few moments' time. You're listening to Ian Collins, in for Matthew Wright. Kevin O'Sullivan is here. Annabelle Giles is here. It's 2:30 even. Let's get the headlines with Rachel Jewell.
Talk Radio, half-hour headlines.
A&E waiting times in England have hit their worst